Hey everyone, and welcome to my second video about evolution. In my first video, and I strongly encourage you to watch it if you haven't, I spoke about the mechanism behind evolution and how genes can be concentrated in subsequent generations. That's changing the gene pool overall. In this video I'm going to go through a couple of examples. One from modern times, real world, that we have seen actually occurring, recorded, and one from millions of years ago type of thing that explains more about the timelines and how long evolution can actually take. So my first example here is about the peppered moth. This is a moth that usually is mostly white with black spotting on it. Sometimes, however, due to natural variation in the species, sometimes the black spots are large enough that they cover basically the entire moth. Might have a little bit of white spotting on it, but it looks black as the predominant color. Now, the predominantly white coloring on these moths gives this moth a great camouflage, especially on something like a birch tree, which is basically the same. It's mostly white with a little bit of black. These moths can blend right in. They're very, very difficult to see. In some areas populated by this moth, however, the Industrial Revolution had a very significant, very profound effect. Soot and other debris, contaminants actually fell and covered a lot of the trees, the rocks, the environment that the moth was living in, and turned most everything black. When this happened, the moths that were black, the ones that were or mostly black with white spotting, suddenly they were the ones that had really significant, very, very effective camouflage. The ones that were white stood out like a sore thumb. As a result, the ones that were mostly white ended up getting eaten most of the time, did not reproduce, did not have offspring, which meant the gene pool started to very quickly change. The moths that were mostly black were able to reproduce more readily, more frequently, and they were the ones able to really contribute to the next generation's gene pool, thus changing the concentration of the genes, and black moths became the predominant kind. Once these areas that the moths were living in, the environments, were cleaned up, things changed. Well, the process continued, and the moths that were mostly white suddenly were better camouflaged. They were the ones that reproduced, and things went back to the way they were before. So in this example, we have a natural variation in the species. That's the coloration of the peppered moth, and the environmental pressures of predation and pollution, resulting in the gene pool having very different concentrations of the genes used for coloring. And this is it's a very, very simple, straightforward, easy example of natural selection occurring in modern times. Now, it's a bit of a preview on the next video, which is going to be about the arguments against evolution. I am going to bring up one thing here, because I've heard of people bringing this argument, or this example rather, of the moths up before, and then claiming that it really doesn't show evolution. It shows, or rather it shows microevolution versus macroevolution. And some people claim that microevolution is fine. There's no problem with that. That can occur. Sure, that's just variation, really. But that's not evolution. Or it's not macroevolution. This distinction between micro and macroevolution is entirely artificial. It doesn't actually exist in real life. And once you really understand the processes of natural selection and the reasons why variation and environmental pressures cause changes in the concentrations of genes in the gene pool, you'll start to really understand why macro and microevolution are meaningless terms. As I saw in one video, one person put it as, you can't walk a mile without taking a first step. In other words, you have to start somewhere. You have to start with the small changes in order to compound them and get to the big ones. That's the general idea here. So my second example today is going to concentrate more on the timelines and the amount of time it takes for evolution to occur. And this example is going to take place on the African savanna, and we're going to have three basic players involved here. So the first would be a gazelle type of creature, regular four-legged herbivore. Say, just for the sake of the example and to make things easy, say it's about 1 meter tall. The second player here is going to be a predator, so lions, cheetahs, whatever you want. And the third player is actually the grasses on the savanna. Most of the time these grasses, and if you've seen any ornamental grasses around wherever you live, I'm sure, these things can get really, really tall. So we're going to say they're also about 1 meter tall, just for the sake of the example. Now, these gazelles can have it pretty rough. They're not very large. Predators are definitely going to be going after them. And they're not going to be able to see very well because the grasses are about the same height as the animal. But, like pretty much every animal on Earth, there's going to be variation in the size of the creature. So if you have a few of these animals that are tall enough to see over the grass, just a little bit even over the tops of the grasses, that's a significant advantage in terms of being able to see a predator coming. So for instance, if you're shorter than the grasses and you have, a blocked view of everything around you, it's very difficult to see what's going on. But if you take the top of that grass and lower it just enough that you can see over it, that's a significant advantage. You can see the grass bending, and if you see, grass constantly bending towards you, there's probably something there. It's probably a good idea to get away. So having that extra, just tiny little bit of height can make a big difference, and can mean the difference between surviving to reproduce and not. But what does this mean overall? Well, in the next generation, the animals that survive, obviously, are the only ones that can reproduce. If the animals that are taller have a better chance of surviving, that means that the genes controlling height are likely to be concentrated a bit in the next generation. Now, this won't amount to a great deal in a single generation. The average height of these animals, being 1 meter tall, to start, say, might only increase 1/10 of a millimeter. I mean, this is a minuscule little amount. Each subsequent generation, though, this same pressure will cause the same variation to continue to change the concentration of these genes in the gene pool. That little extra bit of height will make spotting a predator further away that much easier. So there's a continuing advantage to this variation, and that will cause it to compound over generations. So how long does this actually take? Well, that's really the issue here. After one generation, 1/10 of a millimeter change isn't even measurable. It's within margin of error. So even if you could get somebody to go out and measure the height of all these various animals to a ridiculously precise degree, you're still going to say that there's no change, or at least there's no observable change. After even 10 generations, you're still going to say the same thing. You're only going to have a 1 millimeter change, which is just, it's a tiny, tiny little amount. You're not going to see any difference. After 1,000 generations, though, that's different. Suddenly it's a 10 centimeter change. After 10,000 generations, it's a meter change. That is significant. But, think of it. If this animal has, say, 15 years, if it takes 15 years for this animal to get to sexual maturity, that 10,000 generations means you have 150,000 years that you have to wait in order to see this change. And that's a ridiculously long time, and that's why this stuff is so difficult to see, so difficult to measure. But evolution and natural selection, it's just a process. It's not in a rush. There's no goal. There's no intended target for this stuff. Evolution occurs at the speed of generations. But give it 200,000 years, and it'll turn a herd of gazelles into a herd of giraffes. another important thing to note here is that another population of these original gazelles may have evolved in a completely different way. It all depends on the environmental pressures they're exposed to. So instead of, say, tall grasses, you might have had one particular population of gazelles exposed to rocky conditions, colder conditions, that type of thing. In which case being tall doesn't help. Actually, it's a hindrance because there's more body mass to heat. But being smaller, having thicker fur, that's great. That's a fantastic advantage. So the variation in the species that allows for thicker fur or being smaller, those animals are more likely to survive and concentrate those genes in the gene pool. So after 200,000 years, these original gazelles in one area will have evolved into something like a giraffe, and in another area they will have evolved into something like a mountain goat. And beyond that, any animals that weren't exposed to any particular or any constant environmental pressure, assuming they still survived, they would still be largely unchanged. So you still have that original species around, even though you have two other daughter species that have evolved in completely different ways. So what happens when you start chaining these events together? Say you start with a small mouse-like mammal. Give it 100,000 years, and it will have spread out, geographically as the population is increased, assuming it's not, going extinct or anything like that. And these different populations, exposed to different environmental pressures, will end up with different sets of genes that are concentrated in their particular gene pools. And they will still be largely similar to the original animal, but they will have differences as well. But take each of these slightly changed populations, give them another, 100,000, 200, 300,000 years or whatever. And as they either expand their territory, move around, and are thus exposed to different environmental pressures, or they find that different environmental pressures come in on them, changes in climate or predators increasing their range, for instance, they'll continue to be under pressure to survive, and their gene pools will continue to change in response to this. Now, as these different groups of creatures grow, the different combination of environmental pressures that they're exposed to will shape their gene pools and shape the concentrations of genes that they have in their gene pools. And eventually what you'll end up with is creatures that are vastly different from the original. So that's it for this time, guys. Next video will be the validity of arguments that people make against evolution and the problems really that are at the core of these arguments. And I've given a couple of examples already, but I'll go into more detail later. So thanks for watching, and hope you enjoyed.